Watch on mobile devices or the big screen, all for free. No subscription required. Download Beely now.
Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. Imagine a crime-fighting team made up of a concerned doctor, an undercover ex-biker, and a shy biochemist. Yet this unlikely trio is what it would take to try and stop an accused murderer. Exhibit A, the DNA of a virus. It started with a love story. Jennifer Anderson was invited to a dinner party where her cousin introduced her to the guest of honor, Charles Tyendinaga. Charles was smitten with her immediately. Jennifer was a recent university graduate back from years of travel, now managing a clothing boutique. Charles Tyendinaga was a refugee from Uganda, a law student who narrowly escaped the repressive regime there. He fled to Canada, where he had enrolled at McMaster University and studied political science. At the time, the Canadian job market was proving inhospitable, and Tyendinaga was almost penniless. But Tyendinaga was successful in another field. He could make himself irresistible to women. Though Jennifer Anderson was not given to casual sexual affairs, the day after she met Tyendinaga, she went to bed with him. He did not wear a condom, but she was not concerned. She was taking the pill. AIDS only happened to gay men or IV drug users, so everyone thought. It was 1986. AIDS was still a relatively new disease. There was no cure. Doctors believed that it was almost 100% fatal. The result was often hysteria. This was the spacesuit era, when nurses and doctors, even some clergy, wore gloves, masks, and gowns to approach anyone suspected of having AIDS. Over the next year, Jennifer's health was fine, except for rather frequent colds and flu. But Tyendinaga was suffering from excruciating headaches. She urged him to see a doctor. The doctor found he had swollen lymph glands, indicating the presence of an infection. Tyendinaga conceded to her he probably had the AIDS virus. Before coming to Canada, he had had an affair with a prostitute who worked the university bars. Supposedly, he had even fathered her child. At that point, Uganda had the highest concentration of AIDS in the world. 25% of all sexually active adults had the virus. Both the prostitute and the child had died of AIDS. Even after his tests came back confirming he had AIDS, Tyendinaga continued to have sex with Jennifer Anderson. He never told her about the tests, and he never wore a condom. Around this time, Tyendinaga and a fellow Ugandan borrowed money from friends and opened the African shop. Tyendinaga was knowledgeable about the paintings and artifacts, and he had the passion of a salesman. Jennifer's ardor was cooling towards Tyendinaga because he would make a date for Friday and show up Saturday or not at all. One day, Jennifer ran into a friend of her cousin's, Linda Booker. When Linda casually mentioned she was also having an affair with Tyendinaga, it was the final straw. Jennifer stopped calling. Tyendinaga never seemed to notice. Shortly after this, Jennifer went to give blood. The Red Cross, which had been screening blood since 1985, sent her a letter saying that her blood had been rejected. She was advised to visit her family doctor. When her doctor opened the letter, he gasped and said, "Oh dear, I have bad news. You're HIV positive. You better not have sex with anyone. You are a walking time bomb waiting to go off." From what little she knew about AIDS, she expected to die within weeks. She was 26, single, the beloved daughter of a well-to-do family, and she just tried to adjust to the knowledge that her life was over. It was devastating. Jennifer went looking for a female doctor. That's how she came to Dr. Cheryl Wagner, one of the few women in 1988 treating AIDS.
At this point, I had a lot of experience with HIV, but most of my practice for the previous 5 years had been with gay men. So she was, I believe, actually the first woman I saw with HIV. She had just met this man, and she was so concerned that she may have infected him.
5 days later, Linda Booker also went to see Dr. Wagner. She also tested positive for the AIDS virus, and the same man was also responsible, Charles Sinyanga. So Linda wrote him a letter clearly stating that both she and Jennifer had tested positive, and because of the high incidence of AIDS in Uganda and your promiscuous behavior, it is virtually 100% certain that you too are a carrier of the AIDS virus. The letter ended with the ultimatum that if Sinyanga didn't cooperate and reveal the names of his sexual partners so they could be contacted by an anonymous third party, she would allow her doctor to report him to the public health authorities. He didn't respond. Cheryl Wagner notified public health, and a nurse was dispatched to tell Sinyanga that he was obliged to be tested. He was found to be HIV positive and instructed not to have unprotected sex. As he often did with members of the health community, Sinyanga assured her that he always practiced safe sex, and that besides, these days he was celibate. A year later, a third woman arrived in Dr. Wagner's office. She too was HIV positive. And again, her partner was Charles Sinyanga.
At that point, I almost fell off my chair because this was 1 year later. This was clearly a new infection. This was a man who I knew had been counseled, who I knew knew his HIV positive status. I think as soon as she walked out of the door, I was on the phone to public health and asked to speak to the medical officer of health for Toronto.
She persuaded the health authorities to issue a rare Section 22, forbidding Sinyanga from having sex at all. Francine Dalton, woman number 3, had met Sinyanga at a rock concert. She found him very considerate. The first time they had sex, she insisted he wear a condom. He agreed, then pulled it off right before he entered her, even though he knew he was infected and that he'd already infected 2 other women. Gradually, the relationship began to take on a familiar pattern. Sinyanga would make dates and show up late or not at all. Soon, there was a 4th woman. What would it take to stop this man? Amazing as it seems, what Sinyanga was doing, namely infecting women with a fatal virus, was not a crime in Canada. The reason? In a society of sexually active adults, it was virtually impossible to prove that one person, and one person only, was the source of a sexually transmitted disease. Around this time, Cheryl Wagner was following a case in Florida where a dentist was being sued by his patients for giving them AIDS.
The scientists had shown that the virus that he had was genetically similar to the virus in his patients, proving that his patients had acquired the HIV virus from him.
Cheryl Wagner wondered, could something similar be done in this case? Enter an unlikely hero. Dr. Michael Montpetit, 31, had recently joined the Federal Center for AIDS. He jumped at the chance to match the DNA of Sinyanga's virus to the infected women. Little did Montpetit know that for the next 2 years, this case would dominate his life, invade his solitude, and thrust him into the media spotlight.
The women decided that they were, at this point, frustrated enough with the public health process and the lack of protection that public health had given them, that they were ready to sort of take this very tentative foray into the criminal side of the investigation.
But if there was to be a trial, the police would have to gather evidence. The assignment was given to Inspector Terry Hall, a legend in the OPP for his courage working undercover with bike gangs. The women would have to reveal every intimate detail of every sexual encounter with Sinyanga and any other lover over the past year and a half.
Sinyanga was just like a biker, except he didn't have a bike. In these kind of interviews, you have to get into very explicit details with these women as to the actual act that took place and every act that they had performed with the man. And it's very, very difficult for them to be interviewed and to discuss that sort of thing.
One of the first women Terry went to interview was Joan Estrada. Joan was a star athlete from a financially strapped family. She'd always dreamed of traveling to exotic places, but money was an obstacle. Sinyanga seemed the next best thing. They dated a few times. Then he took her to his place. He told her that he rarely dated and that she was special. Joan trusted him. After all, he'd attended a Roman Catholic seminary in Uganda and told her he considered becoming a priest. He promised, because she was special, he would use a condom. He didn't.
Within weeks, she developed a rash over her whole body, lost 15 pounds, and couldn't even summon up enough energy to get out of bed. Eventually, it passed. A year later, she found out she was HIV positive. She wanted to die at once to avoid the shame of people learning of her condition.
Your victims are in homicide are dead. And now I'm dealing with an investigation where my victims are alive but dying before your eyes, as you do your investigation. And it's not like a bleeding knife wound. It's a long, slow death.
Soon there was a fifth victim, Nancy Gauthier, a single mother. Then a sixth, Danielle Fitzgerald, who had been date raped by Sinyanga. He had insisted, even though she said no, that she wanted it. Michael Montpetit worked for months trying to identify the DNA of the women's virus. It was like hitting a wall with no way over or through it.
It was very frustrating time after time to see my positive controls work beautifully, my negative controls not show anything as they should, and my samples not show anything at all. And that was very frustrating.
Montpetit was trying to replicate the technique used in Florida, but it just wasn't yielding results. Without his evidence, there could be no case against Sinyanga. A year went by. During this time, the women went back and forth about whether they would testify. It was very difficult for them because none of the women's parents knew that they were HIV positive. So the idea of testifying in a public trial was terrifying.
I was concerned what that would do to their emotional health and also their physical health, because stress can play havoc with the immune system.
Montpetit had been proceeding on the assumption that Sinyanga's AIDS virus was a subtype B, a North American strain, like the Florida dentists. But given that nothing was working, he decided to try something radically different, and it worked. Not only was Sinyanga's virus different than the dentist, it was an African subtype A, a strain never before seen in North America. At Sinyanga's preliminary trial in February 1992, a big issue was the question of consent. The women had consented to having sex. They hadn't consented to being infected with a deadly disease. But would that distinction hold up in court? the star witness was Michael Montpetit.
The reactions from all the women indicated that all of them shared HIV subtype A, which is not commonly found in North America. And that was a first very strong indication that these women were all infected from a common source.
The women gave very moving testimony about the catastrophic effects on their lives and dreams from being infected with AIDS by Sinyanga. Their health was failing. They were isolated by despair and the stigma of AIDS. Joan was so suicidal, Dr. Wagner and others worried about her. The judge in the preliminary trial allowed 2 charges to stand: sexual assault and gross negligence causing bodily harm.
But Montpetit had yet to prove that Sinyanga was the source of the women's infection, and that would prove its own incredible adventure.
All he had left of Sinyanga's blood was enough for 2 more tests. There was no chance of getting any more. It was before defendants had to provide blood samples. Montpetit was nervous about using up what was left of Sinyanga's original blood sample. He'd heard about a method developed by 2 Australian scientists to dilute such samples to produce volumes of testable material. But though he could locate the microscopic molecules in the lab, he couldn't find the 2 scientists.
One of the prosecutors was convinced that Terry Hall could do anything. So he asked the OPP investigator to find the Australians. Hall did just that in a couple of hours.
Using the new technology, instead of having enough for 2 or 3 tests on Mr. Sinyanga's sample, I had enough for several hundred tests.
The Australian technique worked. It amplified the sample 400 times. Meanwhile, the AIDS virus was further insinuating itself into the women's immune systems. They were getting sicker. By this time, Sinyanga had met and married Connie Neal, who felt that he was being victimized by the women and was determined to stand by him. Finally, Montpetit could attempt a comparison between the DNA of Sinyanga's virus and that of the infected women. The day he discovered that the DNA profiles matched was one he'd never forget.
I was ecstatic. I bounced around the laboratory for an entire afternoon when I took the picture and saw the material present on the gel.
By June 1993, the trial was ready to proceed. The judge,
Dougal McDermott,
had a habit of making his judicial notes directly into his computer. Michael Montpetit testified that the DNA of the women's HIV was consistent with one another and with the accused, Charles Sinyanga. The conclusion? One person, and only one person, was responsible for their being infected with AIDS: Charles Sinyanga.
All the women testified about the devastating effect of what Charles Sinyanga had done to them. But Joan Estrada's was particularly moving. I always wanted to have children. Now I can't. I'm 25 years old, and this should be the prime of my life. And what do I have to face? Death. Look at me, damn you. Are you proud of yourself? Sinyanga never looked up. The question on everyone's mind was, why did Sinyanga do it? Why did he continue to have unprotected sex with women after he knew he had AIDS?
He had a capacity to charm even the public health nurse who was seeing him, even the doctors who were seeing him. But underneath that, there was somebody who I felt all along was cold, calculating, and not confused about HIV. This was a smart man. This was a man with 4 or 5 years of legal training himself. I felt he knew exactly what he was doing. And just didn't care.
His lawyer at first argued that HIV didn't cause AIDS and that Sinyanga was suffering post-traumatic shock due to the trauma of his Ugandan university days.
With the evidence, the way it was presented, the evidence was there. There was no doubt that he infected these women. There was no doubt that he knowingly infected these women, in my mind, and from the evidence that was presented. So I was very confident of a conviction.
The judge said he would consider this decision and render it in a few weeks. He didn't have a few weeks.
Exactly 13 days later, Charles Tyendinaga died of meningitis, a treatable disease.
Justice McDermott had already written 128 pages of his decision. He simply deleted the file.
For the women, it was terribly frustrating because this was typical of Charles Tyendinaga. He was always the man who would call up and say he'd be there on the weekend and then never show up. For them, it felt like once again he had done it to them. He had missed his final date.
This man didn't get his just due. He took the easy way out.
The women were left trying to deal with their shattered lives, afraid of having intimate relationships for fear of infecting partners. Words can barely describe their isolated and fragile existence. Francine Dalton recently died of AIDS. Cheryl Wagner cared for her up until the end. Terry Hall held her hand as she went into her final coma.
More than a dozen other women who were infected by Tyendinaga have come forward since the trial. 2 others died of AIDS.
This case brought 2 things to me. One is a deep appreciation for how easy it is to become engrossed in small details and to dissociate oneself from the ramifications of one's science. The other is how dedicated people really put their lives into what they do, and how, in some ways, nobody but them can appreciate how much time and effort and heartache they invest into these projects.
The Tyendinaga case was unique in so many ways, not the least of which is that there may never be another case where the infection so clearly came from one and only one person. There is still no law in Canada to prevent what Tyendinaga did. If you had to pick one skill that characterizes the best forensic scientists, it might be curiosity. A driving curiosity to understand how things work and how people think, particularly how criminals think. Alec Johnson was a big fish in a small pond. He and his wife Judy owned a gas station restaurant on the edge of the Tyendinaga Reserve. The Johnsons were proud of their house, and especially of their shiny, finished floors. As things turned out, they were to be a forensic godsend. Usually, her husband locked the money in the house safe. But not tonight. Two rounders, each with long records of theft and robbery, figured Alex might have some money around the house. And as they drove that night, they had trouble on their minds. They reached the Johnsons' house around 5 in the morning. To hide their identities, one of them wore an Elvis mask, the other a ski mask. Ski Mask carried a Beretta 22 caliber semi-automatic, a mean little thing. Elvis wanted some kind of weapon too. Their plan was simple: crash into the house, scare the bejesus out of the couple, and beat it with the loot. Alec and Judy were awakened by the sound of their door being smashed in. Ski Mask demanded money, but Alec wasn't going to give up the money he and Judy worked so hard for, not to a couple of pipsqueaks in ridiculous masks. Elvis screamed, "Shoot him!" Meanwhile, Judy slipped down the stairs. Elvis said he didn't want to hurt her, he just wanted money. Because the banks were closed for Christmas, the briefcase brimmed with almost $10,000. The nearest house on the reserve was 15 minutes away. Alec Johnson had been shot 3 times. He was alive, but barely.
Something like this is really, really unusual. It's really unusual to have something this serious happen on the reserve. When I got there was a couple of Ontario Provincial Police officers there. Of course, they're called initially for backup because we didn't know really what we had. When I got there was 2 officers there protecting the scene. The ambulance had been there and gone.
The Tyendinaga First Nations police deal with keeping order and petty crimes. Given that this was a major crime, they called in the Ontario Provincial Police. Jim Eadie gathers the clues at the crime site.
Probably the most important point of any crime scene is the point of entry to the crime scene. Historically, in my experience also has been that part of the crime scene oftentimes holds the best evidence that'll be available.
This is the high-intensity part of the job. The bad guys are nervous, their sweat is running, their hearts are pumping. No matter how much planning they've done, this is where they usually slip up. 90% of the fingerprints Eadie finds, he lifts from the point of entry. Emergency crews were intent on rushing Alec Johnson to a nearby hospital. As a result, most of the prints were trampled and smudged. But on the stairs leading up to the bedroom, Eadie gets lucky. Partial prints from 2 different running shoes stand out beautifully against the Johnsons' clean, shiny hardwood floors. Eadie dusts them and photographs them. Eadie finds 3 shell casings. These will be sent to the Center for Firearms Analysis. In the kitchen, Eadie finds a strange chunk of wood. What's it doing in the house? It looks like it's been broken off something larger.
When I looked around the outside of the house, I saw a broken sawhorse there, and it appeared that one of the legs had been pulled off the sawhorse. And in this particular location, I could see footprints in snow leading to another sawhorse. And I felt strongly at the time that those were probably footprints connected to one of the suspects in this case.
Did you know that footprints are 50 times more likely to help an investigator than fingerprints? Neither did I. Well, that footprint was about to become Exhibit A. Back at the Johnsons, Eadie wants to make a cast of the print, but first he has to photograph it. Not an easy task given the brilliant white snow. But if he doesn't photograph it, he may find irregular details and funny little marks on the cast caused by wedges of mud or pieces of grass stuck to the shoe's sole. Eadie is a master on the subject of shoes. He even gives lectures about them at the museum. Which one? The Bata Shoe Museum.
No two things are made exactly the same, wear the same, break the same, or tear the same. And that applies directly to shoes. Even modern day shoes in modern processing plants are all come off the assembly line with their various uniquenesses, oftentimes microscopic. But I came to the Bata Shoe Museum a couple of years ago, and I found some really interesting examples, or historical examples really, of evidence that people were aware of and collected and synthesized and processed evidence of footprints because of the number of examples of, shall I say, deception or attempts at deception by the design of shoes. One of the examples that we use here, the Aboriginal executioner's shoes, which are handmade again. The soles are designed with emu feathers on the bottom. So it's impossible to follow the footprints or to make any discovery about the person who was the executioner because there are no useful footprints to draw any conclusions from.
I guess you can understand Mr. Eady is passionate about his subject. Eady prepares to make his cast of the footprint. It doesn't help that the temperature is rising and the snow is getting softer. Usually, he uses dental plaster. It's exceptionally hard and records very fine detail. But plaster is too heavy for snow. So the material Eady uses is flour sulfur.
I very carefully take the sulfur and I carefully pour the sulfur into the footprint. And as you can see, you end up with what appears to be, and in fact is, a puddle of sulfur in the snow. But in fact, what's happened is the instant that the sulfur touched the snow, it hardened, just like that.
Judging by its treads, it looks like the kind of shoe an NBA point guard might wear, or a kid in the playground. You'd think that with all the running shoes around, somebody like Jim Eady would find it a curse. But because of the fierce competition among sneaker manufacturers, they're always changing their models, always coming up with new arrangements of swirls and circles and exotic soles. So different runs of shoes and different years have different patterns.
So I took my cast, the cast in sulfur, and I took it back to my office and photographed it. And I prepared two copies of the photograph, actually a scale-sized copy of the cast that I could work with. But I copied quite a number of copies in a smaller version. And these were for distribution to the investigating officers because the cast actually shows a very good overall view of the details of the bottom of the shoe.
It seems to match the partial footprint he found on the stairs leading up to the Johnsons' bedroom. Meanwhile, Alec Johnson was in serious condition, with bullet wounds to the chest, leg, and head. At 4 p.m. on New Year's Day, investigators got one hell of a present. A message turned up on the OPP's Crime Stoppers line.
In that break-in, the one where the guy got shot, you ought to be looking at two people by the names of Pete Benedict and Frank Lanoux.
Usually on Crime Stoppers, it's thieves telling on one another. That's probably what happened in this case. There isn't a lot of honor in the criminal culture. Police can't find a listing for Frank Lanoux, but they find a Pete Benedict. The listing for Benedict is in Cornwall, about an hour's drive from the Johnsons. Lots of times, criminals live in one area and drive to another to do a job. But police have learned to spread their net a little wider. When Lewis and Detective Rick Myers pull up in front of Benedict's house, they see the red Pontiac, the vehicle Judy Johnson thought she saw as she fled her home. Inside, investigators find a bundle of bills marked in what seems like Judy Johnson's hand, and a Beretta .22 caliber handgun. Investigators find fingerprints all over the car, Benedict's prints are found on the driver's side while someone else's prints are found all over the passenger's side.
We recorded a velocity of 907.3 feet per second. This is the type of firearm that was submitted. It's a small semi-automatic 22 caliber pistol. It's made by the Beretta company. And it's clip loaded or magazine loaded. This is the magazine. And this fits into the bottom or the magazine well of the firearm. What I have here is on the left-hand side, you'll see a portion of a center fire cartridge case. And on the right-hand side, I have my test that I fired from a suspect firearm. And you'll see a small line running down. And that's the prism line that separates these two through the microscope. But what I'm looking at is a portion of each. And this is what we call breech face marks. And if you look at these lines or striations, the way they run into each other, this would constitute a match. It was quite a simple matter in that particular case for me to match up the cartridge cases to that particular firearm.
But the fingerprints, the bundles of money, even the gun which matches the bullets found at the scene are circumstantial evidence. Investigators know a good lawyer could find explanations for all those things that would give Benedict a sizable loophole. They need to find the sneakers. But Benedict's closet holds no sneakers. The only sneakers in the room are a pair of brand new Fila's Benedict is wearing, and the soles don't match the flyer at all. Maybe Benedict isn't the perpetrator. Frustrated, the investigators ask Benedict about Frank Lanoux. Benedict insists he never heard of him. As he gestures, investigators notice something glittery on Benedict's finger, a new ring. Benedict is asked to empty his pockets. Among the contents, they find a receipt, dated the day of the robbery. There's no tax on the purchase because as a native, Benedict is exempt from tax. The ring, it turns out, is from a jewelry store in a mall an hour away. On a hunch, investigators decide to check out the mall. Maybe Benedict bought more than just a ring. At the last shoe store in the mall, a clerk recognizes Benedict's photo. And yeah, he came in just before New Year's, was wearing a perfectly good pair of Air Nikes, hardly used. That's a $140 shoe, you know. And he buys a pair of Fila's, which aren't as good, and he says to me, chuck the Nikes in the garbage. That's when investigators had another stroke of luck. Because of the Christmas holiday, the garbage hasn't been picked up yet. Edie checks the sneakers against the print, checking first for size. They match.
And we had now recovered shoes that could be linked clearly to one of the suspects. I could see very clearly that precisely this element of the shoe, that little piece of the shoe, has a cut on the end of it. And if I look across on the test impression of the suspect shoe, exactly the same element has exactly the same little cut on the end of it. And I simply continue that process, in this case, marking 10 characteristics, 10 accidental characteristics that I can see in the test impression that are also found in the suspect's shoe. I also noticed that the general wear is the same on the suspect's shoe. I also noticed that it's exactly the same size and exactly the same pattern. And my conclusion is that no other shoe in the world would have created this mark on the staircase except the suspect's shoe.
The pieces were now falling into place. Based on what they now knew, the OPP arrested Frank Lanoux. He was fingerprinted, and his prints checked out against the prints found in Benedict's car. They matched, proving Benedict had been lying when he said he didn't know Lanoux. Well, you're probably thinking it's all wrapped up. Think again. Unless investigators could determine which one of the two perpetrators was the gunman, they might both walk. Judy Johnson had identified the gunman as the one wearing the ski mask. Was it Benedict or Lanoux's face behind the shooter's mask? The masks had been recovered the day after the shooting, a half a mile down the road, and sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences to be analyzed for DNA. DNA is the most revolutionary development of the century in forensic science. DNA is found in virtually every cell of our body, including hair, teeth, and all bodily fluids. Scientists had found traces of saliva inside the mask. These were analyzed by the lab and compared to samples taken from each of the suspects. One of the suspects, while being interviewed, had smoked a cigarette in the police cruiser. Not only is smoking bad for you, but your saliva is loaded with DNA. When they compared results, they now knew Benedict had worn the Elvis mask. By the process of elimination, Lanoux was the shooter. At the trial, prosecutors presented the masks, the gun, the casings, and the marked money, and the fingerprints in the car. All of this tied Lanoux to Benedict, but it was circumstantial. It was this, Exhibit A, that clinched the case. The fact that their prints were found on the stairs going up to Johnson's bedroom proved they'd been in the house that night of the shooting. Before Jim Eady could even testify, the defense lawyers pleaded their clients guilty.
Well, thieves aren't that committed to doing a good job, is my experience, and they always make mistakes, and the mistakes tend to compound on each other, and I find that if I can see that in the crime scene, if I can spot those errors in the crime scene, then those are the opportunities, the windows of opportunity that I focus on to find good evidence.
Benedict and Lanoux were sentenced to 6 years in the penitentiary. As for Alec Johnson, he would need years to recover from the brain damage from the shooting. This was a case where a dedicated forensic scientist stopped a couple of bad guys cold in their tracks.
The stories on Exhibit A are based on actual cases. The names of the victims have been changed to protect their identities. The names of the guilty are real.